there were there's two sequences that kind of work and play on each other too. The funeral sequence where you have what was reported and what really was.
Yeah.
Where you get mostly Aunt Essie bitching about other characters and Tony D kind of flubbing his words as he's going through this eulogy for Polly, whereas the Tumbleweeds version is from Wub's perspective, which is a very unreliable perspective in Tumbleweeds, and is not nearly as accurate as the story reported in Norwegian. And if you've ever been to funerals too, you always have these people kind of mentioning these things about characters and then long pauses in between trying to think of anything else that they could say about someone.
Well, in here too, there's the scene. I think he meant early in the book. We never talked about it. Paulie gets the gift of a parrot, and they teach. We might have mentioned it earlier. And Paulie and Tony Tony Delaguardo teach him a lot of curse words, and then literally probably 2+ million words later, we come back to someone mentioning the parrot. I think it's Tony Delaguardo talking about the parrot. And so that's the kind of awkward thing. And there's a scene that's sort of a mirror reflection of if you ever watch the first Godfather. There's the scene where the guy comes in and he's talking to himself about what he's going to say to the Godfather. Dear Godfather, I'm here to tell you, to wish you wonderful greetings upon the marriage of your daughter. And he's rehearsing this. It's one of the Godfather's killers. And so here's the opposite. Instead of rehearsing it, Tony Delaguardo and a couple of other people are just sort of winging it. And they're just totally like, it's a farce what they're saying about Paulie.
You made me think of something else too, where Bit seems to be throughout this point of the book, and he doesn't appear in the funeral, I don't recall, but he seems to take on different faces of the characters. It's as if once he took control of the narrative, he has like these remnant facets from the beginning and later parts of the book. Talk a little bit about that part too, which there are certain sequences where he'll repeat himself over and over, where he's changing into someone different in a mirror, and sometimes he is directly changing into a different character.
What do you mean by changing into a different character?
Where there's this long sequence where it's kind of he turned to the mirror and he became insert the name, and that's repeated over and over and over, and he keeps on going to the side with the visage of a different person. He seems like in the acid trip, even though it was diegetic to his mind, that he's retained characteristics of characters before the acid trip and after the acid trip, and he continually is in flux with his fictive form.
Well, yeah, and that gives, as I said, that sort of gives more credence to the idea that maybe Bit, in a sense, Bit is a different version of Manny Cole from the Vincetti brothers. Both of those characters come to be self-aware at a certain level. Manny rebels against it. Bit seems to be kind of confused about it, hesitantly accepting it at some level. And even when he comes out of the acid trip, he thinks that there's a greater trip in that he might be in a book anyway. He doesn't necessarily know if it's a book authored by Dan Schneider or Manny Cole, but that there's some guiding force behind him. And again, it's just part of the nature of the character, and it seemed to be natural at the time to have him do that.
Mm-hmm. Now about the funeral sequence again, even its form, there's two passages of prose that are put directly against each other, as it was and as it was reported. That connects then to when Big Frank decides to murder Polly's mistress and her child, who's also Polly's son. That sequence, by the way, we should mention, Ed, is a very devastating sequence in how it's rendered. And it begins with the steep ghosts of glaciers that once hung over this island. Were not in the thoughts of Big Frank, or something to that effect. So it has this grandeur of the glaciers kind of calving into the sea, and then gets into Big Frank's character. There's an excellent contrast with that. And again, there's little moments where Big Frank approaches the mistress where he's just putting his hands together and kind of scheming that puts you right into the moment, even though those are very tiny moments that seemingly shouldn't matter to the narrative. Talk a bit about that sequence. It also is somewhat of a rape scene, but not really, since she's willingly given into Big Frank before he decides to murder the child and her.
Well, that sequence that ends the novel, as opposed to ending the book, that is told out of order, because before we see that scene, we see that Big Frank kills off someone who was the cleaner. And so we don't know what he was cleaning up. We find out later that Big Frank, by this time, had already killed the mistress and the son. He's already come back from the end of the book. So the end of the book actually is earlier in time than what happens in chapter 63, the penultimate chapter. So Big Frank, actually, the people that die on that at the end of the book, Paulie dies in New York City by the Norwegian's hand, and then apparently is then set up in the Diamond Brothers Gentleman Club to be shot by some rogue people from Hartford or the Patriarchs, I forget who, to cover that up. Carla Maravelli is killed by Big Frank just by strangling him, and we think it's going to be a kinky kind of
one punch.
Yeah, we think it's going to be a kinky kind of sex scene, and there's a great film and I got that scene because Carla comes back to her apartment after she's left Paulie, or maybe she's still technically married. She has the apartment. I guess they may have separated, and all of a sudden she's grabbed from behind by the throat, and all we hear is a raspy whisper. And there's this Blake Edwards film from 1964 called The Anatomy of Terror, I believe it's called, where a woman in her garage is assaulted by a guy from behind, and he has this asthmatic breathing. And he basically blackmails her into robbing from her bank. And it's quite a good film with Glenn Ford in it. But I thought that was a great scene to take from film and use it in a different purpose, because he grabs Carla, and Carla is a tough broad. But again, Big Frank is 6'6", 6'7", 280-something pounds of pure muscle, even though he's in his mid-40s by then. He's basically choking her to death because he's holding her literally off the floor. Her feet are dangling. And then he lets her go. And initially, she thinks it's some kind of a kinky sex game. And then, as you said, one punch to her face just crashes it, pushes her nose into her face, and she's dead. And so with that, I wanted to just totally dismiss this last 20 or 30 years of the babes in heel kind of thing, because there isn't a goddamn woman, even one of these ultimate action warriors, that could stand up to a guy who's 6'6", 280 pounds and a killer. Just one punch, she's dead. And then later on, we see that he ends up also killing the mistress and the son, and also killing the guy that he had sent by, I think, the Patriarchs or the people from Hartford as a cleaner. That's just collateral damage to cover his own tracks, because he tells him that guy's going to be killed or something. So he's got this all planned out. He's covered all of his bases. We see him kill the guy who ends up cleaning up the death scene at the lover and the child's mansion. So there's no evidence that anything happened. They could have been abandoned or whatnot. No one knows that Paul even has a mistress other than Big Frank, because Paul has kept it a secret. He wants to keep his son safe, especially not only from his enemies in the business, but also from Carla, because Carla, we know, is a murderess, and she had found out that Paulie had a son with another woman. She could very well have tried to hire someone other than Tony Luff to kill him. So Paul has gone to great lengths, but we know from early on, as I said, the delivery of the orgone box to the mansion gave Big Frank the idea where he lives. So he goes there, and basically he pretends that he's going to take her someplace or whatnot. They were sent by Paulie. By this time, Paulie's probably dead, or about to be killed, and there's a scene where he's pulling the phones out of the wall or whatnot, very calmly, very methodically, and he knows exactly what he's going to do, and it takes a while for the mistress to see what's going to happen, and then after she gives herself up to him, he just very callously just throws the kid on the ground and just breaks the kid's neck, and then he basically,
over and over and
yeah,
over.
Yeah.
It really shows what his sadism is. I can see readers of this applying the same criticism that film 12 Years a Slave got, where it's hard to watch, but it really isn't. It is what it is. And it is only an end to his sadism and how far he's gone in terms of his evil.
Yeah. And so then he cuts up the bodies, throws them into he's already come with some, coolers or whatnot to put the body parts in. He cuts up the mistress and maybe he doesn't cut the child up, I don't recall. But he's got a boat.
In a bag.
Yeah, he puts him in a bag. He takes his boat out and he goes out into the Peconic Bay, the Great Peconic Bay, which is this bay at the end of Long Island, and he's going around and he's dumping the body parts here and there, weighting them down or whatnot, and then he even gets rid of the boat because he goes out to this big rock in the middle of the bay there. It's dark and whatnot, and after he gets rid of all the evidence and he weights the bodies down and whatnot, I think he shoots a hole in the boat and the boat sinks, and all he has is a raft. So he inflates it, and I think this is in March, so it's got to be cold. But Big Frank is prepared. He puts on his pea coat or whatever it is. He's got his raft, and he starts rowing back the mile or two or whatever it is to the shore. And so you have the scene of out at the far end of Long Island. If you go, you have to go maybe 4,000 miles to get to Europe, or 5,000 miles, whatever it is, and he's going from this little rock promontory sticking out of the bay. He's in this raft and he's rowing himself back towards the light, back towards where he came from. So you get this whole idea that Big Frank has been reborn because he's in the utter darkness, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. A cliche, but it's the lights of civilization. It's sort of like a slow motion of the Stargate sequence in 2001, which is in the back of my mind. That Big Frank is slowly, he's propelling himself. He's a man of action. So it's not a motorboat. He's rowing his own arms, and I talk about the heat and the tiredness in his arms.
Yeah, his arms were aflame.
Yeah.
It has very biblical imagery.
And a very Whitmanian. Whitman was in my mind, yes, too, the repetition.
Yes, I agree with that. And how he just continues to row, and then it will be interspersed with his thoughts. That's the anaphora of Whitman is certainly there. Yeah. This was a passage that was far before these sections too, but it warns that the book is going to become mythic. This is where it gets mythic, and it just progressively gets more and more biblical in its sense. Not even with the use of biblical quotes and passages, but just the imagery of the characters too, where his arms are flame and he's rowing back and forth after he's done his murders in.
And the last chapter, hold on, the last chapter 64 too has, I think, a really great epigraph from an Emerson, Lake and Palmer song. It's Carn Evil 9. Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. And this is actually a foreshadowing as well as an epigraph that sums up that chapter and the rest of the book, because the show never does end, because as I said, and you'll probably get to it, is that the end of the novel isn't the end of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right before the true end of the novel, it shows of how Polly's murder again was and how it was reported, and it has Big Frank rowing back and forth while that song Michael Rowe's Board Ashore is playing in the background. And then it shows the possible interpretations that you would have gotten out of had Polly said a different word than you. But it also leads into the first line of the Vincetti brothers, which is a great way to tie in the Four-M Quartet. speak a little bit about that too, because even as you know, if you've read the Pinchetti Brothers, what will eventually happen. This book is far more about what each individual moment happens than the end result of it.
Yeah, well, the book, the novel ends, as you said. It goes back to the beginning of uh,
The Pinchetti
the
Brothers.
Vincetti brothers. I do that in a few things. The book 64 that actually ends the quartet also brings things back to a whole. But even though I have both Big Frank Rowing and Paulie Maravelli, what he might have said that Paulie Maravelli was dead, uh, the actual word or the actual thing that ends the novel is life, and then came
Yes,
life,
and then there was life.
and
Yes.
then came
Yeah.
life. And I actually phrased it, and then came life, because as you mentioned, it has the biblical feel, but I didn't want to say, and then there was life, like, and then there was life. So I had it more colloquially, and then came life, it's about 10 lines after the double ending there of the novel.